I have managed Block 7 of the Orvath-Keth District Residential Station for 14 years. I know the station's rhythms the way I know the residency forms, by repetition and by what it costs when something is wrong. 14 years. 91 tenants processed, including departures, deaths, transfers, and 1 legal dissolution. I have handled flooding in Unit 4 North, a ventilation dispute that ran through administrative arbitration for 22 months, a nest of corrosive mites in the substrate beneath the East Utility Corridor, and a tenant who attempted to sublease their unit to 3 separate parties simultaneously without informing me. I am not easily surprised. I say this not to establish credentials but to explain why. When I tell you that the 8 months Yara Austin lived in Unit 6 West changed the way I understand my job, you should understand the weight of that statement. She arrived on a 6th-day morning in the 43rd week of the cycle. I remember it because I had been expecting her a day earlier and had spent 2 hours sitting in the management office reviewing the paperwork I already knew was correct. The Residential Integration Authority had been specific. The new occupant was a human female, Class 15 origin, assigned to a diplomatic support posting at the Keth-Orvath Secondary Consulate, and she would need a standard residential unit with civilian amenities and no special modifications. I had filled out the standard RIA intake notification form, filed it with the district housing registry, noted the cultural adjustment timeline in my administrative log, 60-day adjustment protocol for non-native species, standard language, and waited. She came through the main corridor door at the start of the mid-cycle transit window carrying 1 bag. 1 bag. I want to be precise about this because my other tenant intakes, in 14 years, have involved a minimum of 4 transport containers and a maximum of 47, and one of those 47 had to be redistributed across 2 corridors because the anti-grav skid I called for was not rated for the combined mass. Yara Austin had 1 bag. It was a dark gray compression-rated field case approximately 60 centimeters long, and it sat on her shoulder at an angle that suggested either that it was heavier than it looked, or that she had been carrying that specific bag, at that specific angle, for long enough that the angle was no longer something she consciously adjusted. I met her in the entrance corridor and went through the intake protocol. Unit 6 West, 12 square meter main room, separate sleeping alcove, shared water cycling access on the west service corridor, climate control defaulted to standard Veldorvani comfortable range with an override panel for guest temperature preferences. She listened with the posture of someone who has already decided they will manage. Not dismissive, attentive, actually, but with the quality of attention that suggests the information is being filed rather than evaluated, because evaluation has already occurred by some prior method I was not party to. She signed the residency form in 9 seconds. I have never seen anyone sign a residency form in under 40 seconds. The form is 11 pages. I asked her as a matter of course whether she had questions about the building systems, the shared amenity protocols, or the cultural adjustment resources that the Integration Authority provided for non-native residents. She said she did not. She thanked me, picked up her bag, and walked toward the elevator. I stood in the entrance corridor for a moment after she left and looked at the signed residency form on my tablet. She had filled in every field correctly. Field 7, Medical Baseline Classification, read, Class 15/Veth Coral Prime, Category 14 Standard, no prosthetic augmentation. I had processed 7 non-native human residents in 14 years, all of them Class 12 or Class 13, and this was the first time I had seen a Category 14 notation in a civilian residential intake. I did not know what it meant. I made a note to look it up and then did not look it up, because the 43rd week of the cycle was also the week the ventilation dispute finally entered its 3rd arbitration round, and I spent the following 4 days producing documentation. The first complaint arrived on day 11. It came from tenant Saravethel in Unit 6 East, which shares a wall with 6 West. Tenant Saravethel is a 4-armed scholarly Velsorvani in their 23rd year of a research posting at the Orvath Keth University Station, and in 23 years they had filed 3 building complaints, all of them regarding ventilation particulate levels, all of them resolved. The Day 11 complaint was different. It stated that the new human occupant was engaging in physical activity in her unit during early morning hours that was generating vibration in the shared wall at an intensity inconsistent with ordinary civilian activity. Tenant Saravethel used the phrase structural concern 3 times in a complaint that was otherwise 11 lines long. I went to Unit 6 West at the first morning hour I could reasonably justify a welfare visit. I knocked. There was a brief pause, and then the door opened, and Yara Austin was standing there in training clothes, a worn short-sleeved shirt and dark utility trousers, both damp, looking not alarmed but mildly curious. I could see into the main room. The furniture had been pushed against one wall. The floor mat that the unit came equipped with had been positioned in the center of the room. There was a water container on the kitchen counter, and I noted that it was a larger container than the unit's kitchen provided, which meant she had sourced it independently. I explained the complaint. She listened. When I finished, she said, "The wall is load-bearing." I confirmed it was. She nodded. She said she would adjust the rotation and move the impact work to the service corridor during the 400 to 600 window if I could authorize access. I said the service corridor was not rated for residential use during that window due to the maintenance cycle. She said that was fine. She would sort it out, and thanked me. She sorted it out. I never received another vibration complaint from Unit 6 East. What I did receive, 8 days later, was a request from Integration Liaison Veth Sorvath, the RIA functionary assigned to monitor non-native civilian integrations in this sector, asking me to file a supplementary intake report. The liaison communicated through the standard RIA interface, and the message was professional in its language, but even so I could read the register behind it. They had flagged something in the automated wellness check data that the building's ambient monitoring system generated for non-native residents. They did not specify what exactly. They asked me to verify that the human occupant was adjusting normally to civilian residential parameters. I sent a brief confirming report. Occupant had arrived, signed residency forms correctly, engaged with building management on one minor acoustic matter, resolved the matter independently. I described this as adjustment proceeding within normal parameters because I did not know what else to say and because, at the time, I genuinely believed it. The second complaint arrived on day 19. It came from Unit 5 West, directly below 6 West. The tenant there, Kethvarath, is a younger Arvathi academic, insectoid, blue chitinous, quiet, the sort of neighbor who leaves notes rather than speaking directly, which I had always considered a sign of civic-mindedness. The note said the occupant of 6 West appeared to be cooking with equipment or ingredients that were generating odors that the ventilation system was not fully containing, and that some of these odors were inducing a stress response in tenant Kethvarath secondary olfactory receptors. The note described the odors as high-intensity biological compounds, and asked whether I could speak with the new resident about kitchen protocols. I went to speak with Yara Austin about kitchen protocols. She was cooking. This was at the end of the late-cycle meal window, which is not an unusual time to be cooking, and the unit's kitchen was being used as intended. The temperature in the kitchen was notably higher than the ambient corridor temperature. She had the climate control overridden, I noticed, to what the readout indicated was a setting that would have triggered the automated welfare alert on any Veldorvani or Arvathi tenant for potential thermal stress. The food on the stove was something I did not recognize. It had an aggressive smell, not unpleasant in the way tenant Kethvarath had implied, but assertive in a way that the ventilation system was clearly working to process. I mentioned the complaint. She looked at the stove and then looked at me. She said, "It's pepper and garlic." From the civilian market on level 3. I said that the building's ventilation protocols for shared residential spaces were designed around a particular range of airborne compounds, and that it was possible some ingredients from certain origin world cuisines could. She said, "Do you want some?" I stopped. She was holding a small bowl and a serving utensil and was looking at me with the expression of someone who is offering food, not making a point. I said after a moment that I appreciated the offer but that I had eaten. She nodded, turned back to the stove, and said she would add a ventilation filter to the kitchen exhaust when she used the high-heat burner and that would solve it. I confirmed this would likely solve it. She thanked me. I left. I stood in the corridor outside Unit 6 West for approximately 30 seconds before I continued my rounds. The filter did solve it. I received no further complaints from Unit 5 West about kitchen emissions. What I began to receive, as weeks turned into months, was a different category of contact from the building's tenants and from the integration liaison's office. It was harder to categorize. The complaints, if they could be called complaints, were less about specific incidents and more about a quality of presence that the building's existing residents seemed to be collectively processing, without having adequate language for it. Tenant Saravethel filed a supplementary note 3 weeks after the acoustic matter was resolved, stating that the vibration had stopped, but that the early morning corridor sounds footsteps, a brief mechanical hum they could not identify, a sound they described as rhythmic low-intensity impact on a hard surface, were still present, and that while they understood this was not a building violation, they were noting it for the record. Tenant Kethvareth sent me another note about the elevator, which they said the human occupant used for unusual loads and at unusual hours. Tenant Orth Seville from Unit 7 West, whom I had never received a communication from in the 3 years they had lived in Block 7, asked me by direct message whether the building's emergency evacuation protocols had been reviewed recently, citing no specific incident but asking in a way that suggested they had been thinking about it. The integration liaison Veth Sorvath contacted me again on day 42. This time, they requested a direct meeting. I went to the RIA secondary office on level 14 and sat across a desk from them, and they pulled up the ambient monitoring data for the 6th floor west corridor. I looked at the data. I am not a biometric specialist. I said so. Liaison Veth Sorvath explained, in the patient register of someone who has explained things before and expects to explain them again, that the ambient monitoring system used by the RIA for non-native resident wellness checks tracked a standard set of environmental markers: temperature deviation, atmospheric compound variance, stress hormonal airborne indicators, and what the system cataloged as Resident Consistent Physical Activity Index. For a non-native human resident in a civilian residential posting, the wellness baseline was calibrated to Class 12 and Class 13 Origin World Standard, which was what the RIA's civilian integration protocols covered. I asked what the monitoring data showed for Yara Austin. The liaison said that the Physical Activity Index for Unit 6 West was registering at a level that the system was attempting to classify as an equipment malfunction. The atmospheric compound variance was consistent with stress hormonal markers, not from the human occupant, but from the surrounding units, all 4 adjacent tenants and the 2 units directly below. The temperature deviation in the unit itself was consistent with sustained high-exertion biological output across a 6-way tower daily window. The system had flagged the unit 4 times in the first 40 days for welfare review, each time finding on follow-up that the occupant was present unharmed, and in the liaison's word, engaged. I said I did not understand what I was supposed to do with this information. The liaison said they were not sure either. They said that they had contacted the RIA's non-native integration protocol office regarding Class 15 residential placement standards, and had received a response indicating that the RIA did not have a residential integration protocol for Class 15 origin civilians, because Class 15 origin civilians had not previously been placed in standard mixed-species residential housing. The protocol office had asked for time to develop guidance. The liaison said this was, from their perspective, an ongoing situation, and that they would appreciate my continued observations. I walked back from the Level 14 office along the main transit corridor and thought about what Tenant Kethvareth had said about the elevator. That evening I reviewed 3 months of elevator usage logs. The unit's elevator was rated for standard residential loads, furniture, appliances, moderate personal cargo. Yara Austin used the elevator for loads that were not unusual in terms of weight, according to the lift's load sensor, but that were irregular in terms of composition. The log showed a recurring pattern of dense, compact items that, based on the weight distribution readings, were significantly denser than typical residential goods of equivalent volume. I could not identify what the items were from the logs. I filed the observation in my personal management notes under a header I had never used before, which I called Unit 6 West, and which I initially thought would have 2 or 3 entries and ended up filling 14 pages. During the 4th month, I began to see clearly something I had only sensed before. It concerned the Level 3 civilian market that Yara Austin visited 3 times a week, at consistent times, and returned from with a bag that was never more than half full by volume. I knew the market's tenancy roster. I had tenants who ran stalls there, and I did rounds that took me past the Level 3 corridor twice a week. And I noticed, at some point in the 4th month, that the order in which she moved through the market had a structure to it. Not the wandering path of someone who shops by appetite or by display, but a specific sequence that covered maximum ground with minimum backtracking, that lingered at the fresh goods stalls first, and the dry goods last, and that paused in 3 locations that I could not initially explain, until I realized they were the 3 points in the market's layout that offered a clean sightline to every other section simultaneously. She stood at each of those 3 points for approximately 10 seconds, just long enough to be someone resting or reading a price board, and then moved on. I did not tell the integration liaison about this observation. I was not sure it belonged in a report. I was not sure what it meant. I added it to the 14 pages. In month 5, she began attending the building's evening maintenance alert tests. These are not resident events. They are system tests run by Sovaketh once per month to verify that the floor alert panels, the atmospheric monitors, and the emergency corridor lights are all functioning. The tests run for approximately 12 minutes and produce a low-level alert tone that most tenants sleep through or ignore. In the 4 years Sovaketh had been running them, no resident had ever asked to attend. On the 2nd test of month 5, Yara Austin was in the East Utility Corridor when Sovaketh arrived to start the sequence. She said she had heard the test the previous month and wanted to understand the pattern. Sovaketh, who was not expecting a resident in the utility corridor at the test start time, said that she was welcome to observe. She observed all 12 minutes. She asked Sovaketh 2 questions, both of them specific and technical, about the atmospheric monitor calibration intervals and the floor panel alert priority sequence. Sovaketh answered both. Afterward, Sovaketh came to my office and said, in the tone of someone who has processed something and not yet arrived at a conclusion, she knows what she's listening for. I wrote this in the Unit 6 West notes and then sat there for a while. In month 3, there was the incident of the water cycling lines. The 6th floor west supply line ran behind the unit's shared wall and fed the water cycling fixtures in 6 West, 5 West, and the north side utility alcove. In month 3, it developed a pressure irregularity that I was not yet aware of. My scheduled inspection of that line was not due until month 5. I became aware of it indirectly. Tenant Kethvareth sent me a note, the 3rd they had sent since Yara Austin's arrival, stating that their water pressure had been unusually steady for the past 2 weeks and asking whether the building had made unannounced maintenance adjustments. I said it had not and went to check the line. The pressure was, as Tenant Kethvareth had noted, steady. More than steady, it was within tolerance at a point where, based on the line's age and the accumulated scaling my records showed from the previous 3 cycles, I would have expected it to be measurably below standard. I checked the pressure regulator. The seal was fresh. The compound used to top it was correct. It was not compound I stocked or that Sovaketh had recently ordered. I stood at the pressure regulator for a moment and thought about Yara Austin's Unit 6 West, which shared the wall directly beside this fitting, and the standard toolkit she said she kept with her. I did not bring this up with her at the time. I noted it. It went into the 14 pages. The 3rd week of month 3 was also when I had the conversation with the integration liaison about what was happening to the resident population of the 6th floor's south-facing common corridor. The 40-meter stretch between the elevator bank and the shared utility alcove that all 6 units used several times daily. The liaison had requested specific foot traffic data from the corridor monitoring system, and when I pulled the numbers I found something that I had not consciously registered but that, when expressed as a data point, was unambiguous. Over the previous 8 weeks, the number of other tenants in the south-facing corridor at the same time as Unit 6 West occupant had dropped to near 0. Not 0, they still used the corridor. They had to. But the simultaneous presence window, which had run at a normal distributed baseline in the 8 weeks before Yara Austin's arrival, had collapsed to single-digit minutes per day. People were crossing paths with her in the corridor at the same rate as before, but almost exclusively in brief transits, and the instances of 2 or more tenants occupying the corridor at the same time as her had effectively ceased. The liaison asked if I thought this indicated a social conflict. I said I did not believe it indicated a social conflict. I said I thought it indicated that the other tenants had developed a strong preference for knowing where she was before moving through shared spaces, and that when they did not have that information they tended to wait until the corridor's status was clear. The liaison wrote something in their notes. I did not ask what. In month 4, there was the matter of the building's emergency assembly point. The Orvathketh District Station's residential emergency protocols designated a primary assembly point on Level 2 in the broad transit corridor outside the secondary customs hub. It was a reasonable location, spacious, well-lit, clear of obstructions, with direct access to the station's main evacuation routes. I had included it in every intake orientation packet I gave to new residents. In 14 years I had used it twice, both times for fire suppression system tests. In month 4, I walked past the Level 2 assembly area and found Yara Austin standing in it. She was not using it for any stated purpose. She was standing in the center of the space, looking at the exits. She had a small device in her hand, the same calibration-grade monitor I would later see Sovaketh identify, though I did not know that yet. She was, it appeared, taking measurements. I stopped and asked if everything was all right. She said yes, she was just checking the sight lines. I asked, for what purpose? She said, general orientation. She said it the way a person says a thing that they understand to be complete as a statement, and that requires nothing further from them, and she went back to looking at the exits. I confirmed that she did not need anything, said good afternoon, and walked on. I added this to the 14 pages and then stood at the end of the Level 2 corridor for a moment, looking back at the assembly area, thinking about the phrase general orientation and what it implied about how a person from Veth Coral Prime oriented themselves to a new space, and whether the rest of us did the same thing and simply did it less thoroughly. The 4th month was also when I found out about the station's maintenance access map. Orvathketh District Station, like all corridor stations of its generation, maintains a publicly accessible structural reference map that shows emergency access routes, utility corridors, and maintenance infrastructure in the residential sections. It is published in the station's administrative registry and available to any resident. In 14 years, I had never had a tenant ask about it. In month 4, the station's administrative registry sent me a routine notification that a resident in my building had requested a certified copy of the full current maintenance access map for the residential district, including all sub-level and exterior access points. This was not unusual in regulatory terms. The document is public. What was unusual was that the requester had also asked for the previous 4 versions of the map going back 12 years, which required a special records request and a 24-hour processing delay. The resident was Unit 6 West. I pulled up the map myself after I received the notification and looked at it for a while. It showed every access panel, every service hatch, every emergency egress aperture in the residential section of the station. It showed the exterior maintenance apertures on each floor. It showed, on the 6th floor, the aperture she had used to reach the east service shaft. It showed the primary and backup atmospheric junction seals on the west service corridor. It showed the location of every manual override panel in the building's emergency systems. She had requested the map in the 3rd week of month 1. I put my tablet down and sat at my desk and thought about the 9 seconds it had taken her to sign the residency form, and the fact that in those 9 seconds she had correctly filled in all 11 pages including field 7. I thought about what it means to arrive in a place, what it means to decide you are responsible for being in a place, and what information you would want to have if the word responsible meant, for you, what it apparently meant for Yara Austin. By the 4th month, the tenant collective had reached a kind of equilibrium. This is the word I used in my notes at the time, and I still think it is the correct word, because it implies not peace but balance, a state in which multiple forces are present, and each has adjusted its position to account for the others. Tenant Saravethel continued their research and said nothing more about acoustic events, though they did, at some point in the 3rd month, begin keeping their own work hours consistently on the opposite end of the early morning window that Yara Austin occupied. Tenant Kethvareth stopped leaving notes. Tenant Orth-Seville began, without any instruction from me, reviewing the block's emergency evacuation routes on a monthly basis and submitting brief reports to my management inbox, which I found helpful even if the instinct behind them was something I was not yet fully able to name. The 2 units on the south side of the floor, 5 West and 7 West, began a pattern I only noticed in retrospect. Their tenants, when traveling the 6th floor corridor toward the shared facilities, consistently timed their movement to moments when they could observe that 6 West's door was closed and the in-unit indicator was stable. Not fear. I do not want to overstate it. Something more like the awareness that the corridor had a quality to it now that it had not had before, and that this quality was most easily engaged with on known terms. The integration liaison Veth Sorvath and I had, by the 5th month, developed a standing check-in meeting on the 2nd day of each 6-day cycle. Most of these meetings were short. There was no new data to act on. The monitoring system had been recalibrated twice for Unit 6 West, and had twice returned to flagging the Physical Activity Index as an anomaly. The liaison had received a preliminary response from the Protocol Development Office indicating that a Class 15 residential integration framework was being drafted and would be completed within 18 months. In the meantime, we observed. What we observed in the 5th and 6th months had a quality I find difficult to render accurately in administrative language, which is the only language I have for it. It was not a series of incidents. It was more like a steady accumulation of things that, individually, each had an explanation, and collectively meant something that neither of us could write in a report. Yara Austin attended the tenant collective's monthly corridor meeting in month 5. These meetings are not mandatory. In 14 years, the attendance rate averages 63%. She attended and sat in the chair nearest the door and did not speak except to confirm, when the meeting's record keeper asked for Unit 6 West's acknowledgement of the fire suppression protocol update, that she had received the documentation and reviewed it. The meeting took 40 minutes. She was present for all 40 minutes. The collective's discussion of the quarterly heating rate increase took 11 minutes longer than usual. I do not believe this was her intention. I believe it was because 5 of the 7 tenants present were sitting with a portion of their attention directed toward Unit 6 West's occupant in a way that made sustained deliberation harder than usual. After the meeting, as tenants were leaving the common room, I saw Tenant Orthsevel approach her and ask, I was near enough to hear, whether she had found the community integration resources useful. Orthsevel manages the building's Voluntary Cultural Liaison Committee and offers this question to all new non-native residents. Yara Austin said that she had found Level 3's civilian market very well stocked. Orthsevel said that was good to hear. There was a brief pause in which Orthsevel appeared to be deciding whether to say something further. They decided not to. Yara Austin said it had been a good meeting and walked to the elevator. I wrote Month 5, attends meeting, market, elevator in my personal notes, and then looked at what I had written and found it was not equal to what I had observed. In Month 6, there was the matter of the service shaft. Block 7's east service shaft runs the full vertical height of the building and provides maintenance access to all utility infrastructure, water cycling, atmospheric processors, power distribution. It is accessed by maintenance staff via the East Utility Corridor. It is not a resident amenity. In Month 6, on a routine inspection, the building maintenance technician, Sova Keth, told me that the East Service Shaft's primary cable housing had been repaired. It had not been flagged for repair. It had not been on the maintenance schedule. Sova Keth told me it had been repaired well, better than the standard they would have applied. As a matter of fact, using a tensioning methodology, they did not recognize that had the cable seated more firmly in its housing than the original installation. I asked who had done it. Sova Keth said they did not know. The repair had been made cleanly, without accessing the utility corridor lock or the maintenance log system, which required a staff authorization code. I walked to the East Utility Corridor and looked at the cable housing. Then I walked to Unit 6 West. I knocked. Yara Austin answered the door. I said as calmly as I could that the East Service Shaft's primary cable housing had been repaired by an unknown party and that I was conducting a standard inquiry. She said, it was failing. I checked it when I heard the tone change in Month 2. I asked what tone. She said the building had a specific acoustic signature on the east side. She had noticed it change around Month 2, identified it as cable housing stress in the primary shaft, verified it with a contact sensor she had with her, and done the repair because she was there and had the materials. She said she had meant to leave a maintenance note and had forgotten to. I stood in the doorway of Unit 6 West and looked at her. She was standing in the main room in the same domestic posture she always occupied, present, mild, slightly patient. I said, a contact sensor. She said, yes. I said, you had cable housing repair materials. She said, she kept a standard toolkit with her. I asked if she knew that accessing the service shaft required staff authorization. She said she had not gone through the staff corridor. She had accessed the shaft from the exterior maintenance aperture on the building's east face, which was not locked because it was rated for emergency maintenance egress, and she had confirmed that the building code permitted emergency qualified access for residents in critical failure conditions. The cable housing had been in Category 3 progressive failure. That qualified. I said, the exterior maintenance aperture is on the 6th floor exterior face. We were on the 6th floor. She said yes. I looked at her for a moment. Then I wrote up the repair properly in the maintenance log, credited to an anonymous resident maintenance report as the building code permitted, and went back to my office. I sat at my desk for a while. I thought about the Category 3 progressive failure notation I had just written. I thought about the acoustic tone change in Month 2. I thought about the exterior face aperture on the 6th floor, and what it would require, in terms of body, in terms of whatever category of physical relationship to altitude and velocity Yara Austin had by virtue of being from a world the classification system described with the number 15, to choose to use it as an access route. I thought about the contact sensor she kept with her. I added 12 pages to my Unit 6 West notes that week. Month 7 was quieter, the equilibrium held. The integration liaison Veth visited once, reviewed the ambient data, noted that the stress hormonal markers in adjacent units had stabilized at a level that was elevated above baseline but no longer spiking, and described this in their field report as successful environmental acclimatization of surrounding tenants to non-standard residential presence. I thought this was an accurate description, and also a description that, when you understood what it meant, that the 5 other tenants on the 6th floor had acclimatized to the presence of something they could not fully categorize by building their own routines around the knowledge of its location, was not the kind of statement that belonged in a standard residential integration field report without a flag. I did not say this to the liaison. They were working within their protocol. Their protocol had not been designed for this. In month 7, the maintenance alert test came around again. This time Yara Austin arrived in the East Utility Corridor before Sovaketh. She was sitting on the floor beside the atmospheric monitor panel with a small handheld device I did not recognize, running, she said, when Sovaketh appeared. A cross-reference check on the East Corridor sensor readings against what she described as the ambient baseline drift she had been tracking since month 3. Sovaketh stood in the corridor doorway for a moment, then came in, sat down next to her, and they ran the test together. Sovaketh came to see me afterward with the quiet bearing of someone who has looked at something large and decided they are going to work with it rather than around it. They said, "She's been running a shadow maintenance log." I asked what that meant. Sovaketh said it appeared that Yara Austin had been tracking the building systems, atmospheric, structural, electrical on her own, in parallel to the official maintenance schedule since she arrived, using what Sovaketh described as very precise field instrumentation. The handheld device was a calibration-grade environmental monitor of a type Sovaketh recognized from military engineering deployment kits. A standard toolkit, she had said. I wrote this down, and then held the pen above the paper for a long time. The evening of the 49th day of month 7, I was in my management office at the end of the late cycle, reviewing the quarter's maintenance budget when the building's atmospheric integrity monitor issued a Level 3 alert for the 6th floor West Service Corridor. Level 3 is the threshold for mandatory evacuation of affected units. The cause was a pressure seal failure in the West Service Corridor's atmospheric junction, the seal between the corridor's standard pressure environment and the exterior hull interface, which maintained the boundary between the station's interior atmosphere and the hard vacuum of the station's exterior superstructure. When those seals fail, the affected area drops to sub-zero temperature within the first 90 seconds and reaches non-survivable atmospheric conditions within 7 to 9 minutes, depending on corridor volume. I hit the evacuation protocol for Units 5 West through 7 West. I contacted the maintenance emergency line. I put on the building emergency kit's thermal overlay. I went to the 6th floor. Units 5 West, 7 West, and the units below had evacuated cleanly. Tenant Saravethel was in the emergency assembly area at the base of the east stairwell and was standing very still and not speaking. Tenant Kethvarath was next to them and had their secondary arms folded against their thorax in what I recognized as an Arvathi distress posture. Tenant Orth Seville had taken charge of the evacuation register and was quietly managing the head count with the kind of focused efficiency that indicated their monthly emergency protocol reviews had been useful. Unit 6 West had not acknowledged the evacuation alert. I confirmed this at the panel in the stairwell. The unit had received the alert signal. The occupant had not transmitted an acknowledgement and had not appeared in the evacuation corridor. I put on the full thermal overlay kit, confirmed my communications link, and went into the 6th floor West Service corridor. The temperature in the corridor was 7 degrees below the standard residential range and dropping. The atmospheric monitors on the wall were reading amber. The seal failure was 3 sections ahead of me, toward the hull interface, and I could hear the differential pressure hissing through the breach point. The corridor's emergency lighting was running red, which cast everything in a flat angular clarity that was, in that moment, not reassuring. Unit 6 West's door was closed. I knocked and said my name and the nature of the emergency through the door. The door opened. Yara Austin was sitting at her kitchen table. She had a bowl of food in front of her and was eating. The food was something I recognized from a previous kitchen complaint visit, the high-heat preparations she made in the evening, the ones that generated the ventilation alerts. She was approximately halfway through it. She was wearing her standard civilian clothes. She did not have a thermal overlay on. She looked at me with the same expression she always had, mildly attentive, slightly patient, present, and said, "I heard the alert. How bad is the seal?" I said that the seal was in active failure, and that the corridor temperature was subsurvivable for most of the building's resident species, and that she needed to evacuate. She said, "I will. Is it the primary or the backup junction?" I said I did not know. She said, "If it's the primary, you want to isolate sections 4 and 5 before the repair crew arrives. If it's the backup, you can wait, but someone needs to be at the manual override panel at corridor junction 2. It won't respond to remote once the temperature drops below the sensor threshold." She put her spoon down, looked at the bowl, appeared to make a brief internal calculation, picked the bowl up and stood. "I'll come look at it." I said, and I am not proud of the register in which I said it, because it came out as closer to automatic compliance than as the measured statement I would have preferred. I said, "Yes, all right, but she needed a thermal overlay." She said she was fine. She said it the way you say you are fine about something that is genuinely the case, with no emphasis, which is different from how people say it when they are trying to reassure you. She was still carrying the bowl. She walked into the corridor ahead of me. What happened next I recorded in my maintenance log, and I have reviewed those notes a number of times since, and I still find them inadequate. She looked at the breach indicators in the corridor and identified within 30 seconds that the failure was in the primary junction. She identified the section isolation points without asking where they were. She spoke to the repair crew when they arrived. She had already reached Junction 2 and confirmed the manual override panel status before they came through the seal bypass. In the clean technical register of someone who has used that language before and is using it again, giving them the sequence they needed to execute the repair safely, and then stepping back and letting them work. The repair took 42 minutes. I stood in the corridor for most of it with a thermal overlay, and a rising sense that I was the least functional person in a 6-person operation. When the seal was restored and the atmospheric monitors shifted back to green, the repair crew chief, Sovaketh, the same technician who had found the cable housing repair, looked at Yara Austin and said, "You've done seal isolation before." Not a question. She said she had. Sovaketh nodded slowly, which is the specific slow nod of someone processing a large amount of information and choosing not to ask any of the questions it generates. They filed the repair report and left. Yara Austin looked at her bowl, which she had set on the corridor floor at some point during the repair. She picked it up. The food was cold. She looked at it for a moment, said it was probably fine, and went back into Unit 6 West. I stood in the 6th floor West corridor under the restored green monitoring lights and did not move for some time. The evacuation all clear came through my communications link. The tenants returned to their units. I stayed on the 6th floor until the last of them had passed me in the corridor. Tenant Sarah Vethel, going by 6 West's door toward 6 East, paused briefly in the way of someone who was aware of what was on the other side of the wall and had decided, some months ago, to hold that awareness at a particular distance. Tenant Kethvareth walked to 5 West's door without looking left or right, which I now understood was not incuriosity, but a form of discipline. I went to my office and sat down and looked at my desk and thought about the SEAL isolation sequence she had given the repair crew, and then I looked at the Unit 6 West folder in my management notes, which was now 31 pages long, and I found that I could not write anything new in it yet. 3 weeks later, on the 7th day of month 8, Yara Austin came to the management office and submitted a move-out notification. Her posting at the Kethorvath Secondary Consulate was completing its rotation cycle. She would depart in 14 days at the end of the standard notification period. She thanked me for the building management services. She said Block 7 was a good building. She said it the way a person says a thing is good when they have evaluated it honestly, and the evaluation came out positive, not warmly, not to make me feel something, but as an accurate statement about the building's merits. I said I had been glad to have her as a tenant. This was also accurate. She left the management office. I sat there for a while. On the 14th day she left. I did not see her go. I was doing the morning round of the building's atmospheric checks, and I came back to the management office to find the key card for Unit 6 West on the intake desk with a brief note in the standard unit return format. All fields completed correctly, no additional comments. I had, in 14 years, never received a unit return form with all fields completed correctly by the occupant rather than by my office. I went to Unit 6 West to conduct the standard departure inspection. The unit was clean, cleaner than standard departure condition, the kind of clean that is produced by someone who has a specific understanding of what clean means and applies it at a different baseline than residential convention assumes. The furniture was in its original configuration. The floor mat was in its storage position. The climate control was set back to Veldorvani comfortable range default. On the kitchen counter there was a sheet of maintenance notepaper. I picked it up. It was written in a clean, slightly compressed hand, in standard Keth compact transliteration script. It took me a moment to recognize that it was written for Sova Keth and my maintenance team. Not for me, exactly, though it began with my name as the building manager of record. It covered 4 items: the East Service shaft cable housing, which she noted would need secondary tensioning inspection in approximately 14 months, the atmospheric monitor calibration on the West Corridor, which she said was running 0.3% below threshold and would drift further without adjustment, the elevator's load-bearing guide rail on the 3rd floor, which had a microfracture she had noted in month 5, and which the load pattern suggested would reach inspection threshold within 8 months, and the water cycling pressure regulator on the 6th floor west supply line, which she had topped up with the appropriate compound in month 3 when it had shown early-stage seal degradation. At the bottom of the note she had written, "Building's in good shape. You run it well." I stood in Unit 6 West and read the note twice. Then I sat down on the floor, which is not something a Veldorvani building manager does in a unit they are inspecting, and read it a 3rd time. She had been maintaining the building, alongside the work she did for the consulate, alongside the morning routines and the market runs and the tenant meetings and the corridor hours. Alongside all of it, she had been quietly running a parallel maintenance audit of Block 7 systems, from the first week she arrived, with the contact sensor she kept with her, logging what she found and addressing the things that fell within what she considered her reasonable reach. The cable housing in month 2. The water regulator in month 3. The elevator guide rail, noted and monitored. The atmospheric calibration drift, noted and tracked. The seal she had known about before the failure, and whose failure point she had been able to predict closely enough that she was already near the end of her meal when the level 3 alert triggered, not because she had not heard it, but because she had known the timeline. I thought about the 31 pages in my management notes. I thought about the integration liaison Veth and the protocol office developing a Class 15 residential integration framework that would be completed in 18 months. I thought about the monitoring system that kept flagging the physical activity index as a malfunction, and the 5 tenants who had quietly reorganized their corridor, routines around the specific location of a single residential unit over 8 months, without fully understanding why. I thought about what it means to settle in. For me, settling into a building means learning which of the corridor lights flicker, where the elevator slows, which neighbors you can hear through the wall when you cannot sleep. It means occupying a space until the space adjusts to you and you adjust to it, until the edges of your presence and the edges of your surroundings wear slightly smooth against each other. I had spent 8 months watching Yara Austin do something that looked, from the outside, exactly like that. She had been present in the building's communal spaces and courteous in the building's communal interactions. She had eaten her meals and done her routines and attended her meetings and filed her forms. She had settled in. What she had apparently also done in the same 8 months was read the building the way her origin world had taught her to read any environment she entered, thoroughly, precisely, and from the ground up. She had identified its structural stress points and its calibration drifts and its failing seals and its microfractures not because she was conducting a formal survey, but because that was, apparently, how she occupied a space. The contact sensor in the standard toolkit, the shadow maintenance log in the calibration grade monitor, the 3 positions in the level 3 market from which all other positions were visible, the acoustic change in month 2 that she had heard through walls I would have needed instrumentation to detect anything through at all. She had settled in. She had simply settled into a much larger space than the one Unit 6 West contained. The note was still in my hand. I put it into my management folder. I made a copy for Sovaketh. I completed the departure inspection, all items satisfactory, unit condition excellent, and closed the folder. Then I sat down at my desk, and for the first time in 14 years of managing Block 7, I filed a formal notation in the building's permanent administrative record. It was brief. It stated that Unit 6 West had been occupied from Cycle 43 through Cycle 43+2 by a human civilian from Veth Coral Prime, Class 15, on a standard residential posting, and that the unit had been returned in exceptional condition with maintenance notes of material benefit to building operations. It stated that the occupant had integrated into the building's residential community without incident and had conducted herself in all matters consistently with the building's resident conduct standards. I looked at what I had written. Then I added one more line, which was not in standard building notation format and which I have not changed or removed in the 3 years since. That in 8 months she had found more things wrong with this building than my maintenance program had found in 4 years, had fixed the ones she could reach, had documented the ones she could not, and had done all of it as a matter of course, the way a person tends to things that are in front of them and that need tending. Which is to say, without comment, without accounting, and without any evident recognition that this was not what everyone did.